Hello everybody, we are still in Canguillo National Park, which is the southern part of central Chile. This time of year, this area is known for these magnificent fall colors that you see all around us. It's also known for its many beautiful volcanoes. Unfortunately, the weather has been closing us out. In other words, we haven't really been able to see these volcanoes or the mountains. So instead of focusing on the iconic volcanoes, we've been walking around through some of the forested areas looking for interesting compositions and beautiful frames that utilize the fall colors. Even though it's completely overcast in the sky, we can still find beautiful detail shots like this to focus on. What's interesting about this location is the river itself is quite beautiful, makes an interesting shape, but there's all of these logs, these fallen logs, black logs with green moss. Then we have this layer of green bamboo leading up to moss and lichen-covered trees displaying the beauty and the full peak of the fall colors. We are going to be using a 19mm tilt-shift lens on the Nikon D850. Come around to this side of the camera and I'll show you guys how it works. One very important thing to point out about this lens and tilt-shift lenses in general is they are manual focus lenses. So you can see here on the side I have all of the degrees. I usually rely on autofocus for nearly everything, but this camera is manual only. And just like most Nikon lenses, Canon lenses, and most lenses in general, sometimes infinite isn't infinite. I've tested this lens and it's pretty much sharp, dead center of infinite, but occasionally it's off just like every other lens. So in order to focus this lens, you can either trust the infinite point or you can do a couple other things. You can shift it, and this is very important. When you're testing the focus here, you want to make sure that your shift point is dead center. You will not get as accurate of a focus if you're shifted down or shifted up. So for the most precise focus, it's best to make sure it's closest to center as possible. Let's go ahead and attach this to the ball head, and I'll show you guys how this works. I'm going to go into the live view. I've already focused the lens at infinite. The camera is shifted dead center, so it's at neutral shift. And what I'm actually going to do is show my level here. So right now I'm completely level. And all I really have in frame, let me go ahead and take a reference shot here. As you can see in this image, this is 19mm. This is me with a level horizon. As you can see, I have some of the trees. Basically, the bamboo is in the center, that green mass of trees there. So if I want to actually try to get the river, I have to get lower to the river and rotate this up. So let's just go ahead and rotate this up and see what happens when I go up all the way. There we go. Just like that. I'm also going to level it out. Same thing, let's go ahead and take a shot just like this. So here, rotate it up, and as we could probably tell before we did this, we're going to lose the river, we're going to gain the trees, but the trees are going to have that distortion from the wide-angle lens. They're actually pointing in towards the sky. You can really see it on the left and right side. It actually looks kind of ridiculous. So we've tried this in landscape mode, rotating up, but let's see what we can get if we move it into portrait mode. So let's just go ahead and change that. Now, if I get a shot set up here in portrait mode with the trees part of the bank, just going to go ahead and rotate that. Let's go ahead and take a shot of this as well. All right, so overall this is much better. If I shoot this in vertical mode in this format at 19mm, I'm getting most of what I want. I'm getting some of the river bank, and the trees. I've only had to rotate up a little bit, so the trees, while skewed, it's not a deal breaker. So this is definitely a possibility for the shot. But what I really want to do here is by utilizing the shift function of the lens and creating this as a panoramic image, I want to take advantage of having that full landscape view of the bottom part here, this river, there's a log here is a beautiful composition element, and then by shifting up, I get everything around. Because by shooting in portrait mode or in vertical mode, I've actually cropped down the scene quite a bit. So I'm going to take advantage of the lens, be able to shoot different pieces in landscape mode, then stitch them together for a bigger frame of view and also a really high resolution end result. So before I actually get started shooting, there's quite a bit of light in the scene. For the examples, I was shooting a single exposure, but what I'm actually going to do is enable bracketing because I want to be able to capture the intensity of the sky. There are little patches of blue behind the trees, and the foreground we have a great range of highlights here in the water and also shadows in the background. So I'm going to enable bracketing. So let's go ahead and do 5 exposure brackets, and I'm going to EV shift that. to -1. Now I'm not sure if I'm going to need all those exposure brackets, but I want to make sure I capture everything that I need, and we'll use the ones that we need later in post. So with the bracketing enabled, this is shifted right in the center. I'm going to go ahead and shift down a little bit. So I'm going to rotate this down. And basically what I'm going to include is the deepest part of the foreground that I want to have in this shot. And I have these beautiful little lava stones here in the foreground. So I'm going to go ahead and capture those. So I'm going to shift down right about here. And I'm going to change the shooting mode from single all the way to timer mode. That way I can press the shutter down. Once I press it down, it'll wait 2 seconds, and then it'll take all of the brackets so I do not disturb the camera. So let's take our first set of brackets. That looks good. So now what I'm going to do is shift up. Now remember, there's no parallax, so this will stitch perfectly, but I still want to make sure that I have enough overlap. And with this kind of lens, you could just get away with 1/4 of overlap. So what I'm looking at is that log. I'm going to bring that down to about here. Still can't see the tops of the trees. And I'm going to shoot this one more time. It's 5 more exposure brackets. Let's shift it all the way up to the very extreme top of the image. 1 more set of brackets. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If this seems a little bit complicated with the addition of a tilt-shift lens and actually shifting the function of the lens, think about this like creating a vertical panorama. Essentially, that's all I've done here by taking different pieces of this image. The end result is going to be a stitched vertical panorama. What I'm doing is just taking advantage of the shift feature to not have to use any gimbals or anything else like that. So let's take a look at the 3 images. Here's the image for the bottom. You can see the lava rocks there on the left side. You can also see the black log crossing. Here's the shot for the middle. Middle, you can see the log there, we can see the green bamboo, and we can start to see the trees as well. Now let's take a look at the final image for the top of the trees. So here we can see the extent of the trees, and if we get the exposure balance right, we'll also be able to see some of the detail in the sky. Just to do a little bit of a recap, this is 3 panels. So 1, 2, 3. I've shot 5 exposure brackets for each panel. Now, truth be told, I probably only need 1 exposure for the bottom part of the foreground. I may need only 1 exposure for the middle ground, but I have a feeling we might need to blend a couple exposures together because the sky is so bright and the foreground is so dark. So this is going to be really fun in post-processing. If I can't solve this with 3 raw files, I may have to do a little bit of blending in Photoshop, then take the 3 panels and then stitch them together later. So it's going to be a little fun in post-processing to figure this out, but I think the end result is going to be worth it. Another thing is, right now, since I've shifted down and I've shifted up, I'm not sure what the final aspect ratio is going to be. With cropping at the end, if I don't like how far down and far up I shifted, we could have something close to a square result. So 1-to-1. But if I utilize part of the bottom and all the way up to the top, we may end up with a portrait-style image. Even with all the variables of what the aspect ratio is going to be and how much blending I'm going to need to do, I'm pretty excited about this image, so let's go ahead and take everything into Lightroom and figure out how we can stitch this back together. Welcome back, everybody. So this is an atypical scene for me, and what I mean by that is it's not something that I typically photograph. But we had such bad weather on this trip, I was trying to teach everything that I wanted to in Photographing the World 4, so I decided this would be a great example to do another shift pano and incorporate fall colors. I also anticipated some issues with the exposure because once again it was backlit. Behind the trees was going to be very blown out, and I waited for there to be little wispy clouds. So for this lesson, we're going to do something a little bit different because for nearly this entire tutorial, we've been doing everything manually. So now we're going to take a little break from that, and I'm going to introduce some different methods as well as some different plugins that help to automate some of the things that we've been doing manually. But first, we're going to use a feature in Lightroom and an acronym that you rarely hear me say, and yes, that's HDR. So let's go ahead and take a look at that. Here in Lightroom, I just have 3 files, or 4 actually, but we have 3 panels. So we have the bottom, the middle, and the top.
So you can see this is the base exposure for the top, really dark in the foreground, but we can see the background, or those clouds and the sky. But if I look at this version and we zoom in, you can see that those leaves are cooked. So leaves are absolutely gone. If I start to roll back this exposure, we start to get them back, but it becomes very difficult. They're actually just little wispy lines, whereas this one right here, you can see they're actually intact. So in this case, this is one of those rare cases where we can try to see if by combining these together in an automated process, will it make our lives easier than trying to do this with luminosity masking or any other way and then build the pano? Well, let's find out. First thing, let's make this Adobe Landscape to pop those colors. Beautiful fall colors. Let's take that sharpening all the way down, especially because we're going to blend. This is the 19mm tilt shift, so there's probably some chromatic aberration on there. Let me go ahead and develop settings. Let's go ahead and copy these settings. I'll just check them all as fine, and I'll just go ahead and paste them all in here so they're in sync. Go ahead and paste them. Let's select these two, this one and this one, go under Photo, Photo Merge, and I can't believe I'm saying this, HDR. Before I edit this, I should point out there's nothing wrong with using an HDR process if it saves you time and if it's the most efficient way to do this. Right now, there's not really anything moving, no wind, the leaves don't rustle, nothing like that. So when I put these together, it should be at least mostly seamless, and in a lot of cases, probably better than I can do with a luminosity mask. It might come out a little bit more clear. So if we look at these settings, I'm going to de-ghost nothing, not going to create a stack. And if I do this auto settings, you can see that it's actually bringing out the foreground. But right off the bat, can't really tell a difference, so I'm going to go ahead and click that, and it's going to apply the settings after it builds this into an HDR photo. All right, let's take a look. And that doesn't look half bad. If I zoom in, I have the stems and the leaves, and everything's actually there. A little washed out in the foreground, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and scroll up, and we'll take a look that yeah, it kind of just did its own thing here. It's not a bad thing, but let's just go ahead and even this out. So for when you are following along 1.25, I'm not going to zero out any of the contrast. This is negative 57. Let's make it 50. I like to use rounded numbers. Just in case I have to come back, I can add small increments. White, so close to 25. Let's just go ahead and make it 25. But to be honest, do we want to bring those whites out? Not necessarily. Let's go ahead and go to 0. Blacks, negative 7, let's make that 0. Vibrance, 0. Saturation, 0. So that ended up being a really quick bump. So you can see that this turned into this, a combination of this and this. So we probably could have corrected it here. We would have lost the little stems. If we zoom in here, we have the little stems. If we take a look at this, you can see that they actually look really, really light. So let's go ahead and take this. We're going to take all three of these, and what we typically would do is select all of our raw files like this, and we do a photo merge as a panorama inside of Lightroom. But just to mix it up a little bit, let's actually do our panorama in Photoshop so we can look at those settings as well. So this time I'm going to select this one, and this one, and we're going to export those. I'll use previous so we can just get them into Photoshop as 3 PSDs. Now in Photoshop with all three open, I'm going to go up to File, Automate, Photo Merge. Now what I can tell you is if I select auto, it'll probably be correct, but I know this is going to be perspective. When you're using a shift lens, a tilt shift lens doing a shift pano, typically it's going to stitch perfectly with perspective because there's no parallax. Add open files, blend images together, and say OK. After a few moments, here is our result. Can you see those little lines here? They go away when you zoom in, but it kind of looks like a Frankenstein picture here. You can see how Photoshop has decided which image to use and how to mask it. So while it's all correct, and if I zoom in, it'll be correct, this background's a little bit dark. So since this is a shift pano and there's no parallax, theoretically I should be able to put these together anyway by myself. So let's omit this masking because I don't like this. I don't like that it used the dark portion of this. And the problem is if I wanted to color correct, compensate for this and help blend it, if I added a curves layer like we usually do between, bump the gamma, you can see that while it is going to adjust the gamma for this, it's not going to seamlessly blend into the next panel because we already have this really harsh edged mask. So we'd have to remask it anyway. So rather than do that, let's create our own masking. So let's delete all of these. Delete layer mask, delete layer mask, delete layer mask. So this is going to be a good exercise. And honestly, it's okay if we just use each piece. We could have taken all these and say align instead of merge to panorama, and it would have given us this result. And we could have done this manually anyway. So we'll start with the bottom, then the middle, and then the top. So we'll take the middle, so we'll create a mask, use the gradient tool, set it here. We'll just take a look really quick, and it looks like the image ends right about here. So what we're actually going to do is just fade it off from about here to here. So now we have this to this. Let's go ahead and turn this on, create a mask. Let's do the same thing. But this time, let's go ahead and take a look at the background. If I command click it, you can see it ends up there near the top. So what I can actually do here is go from about here to here. That looks pretty good. In fact, I can actually make it a little bit more harsh, and we can get some of those better colors. So from here to here. Now that looks much better overall. The tonality works really well, and it blends right over top of itself. So with this now being our correct panel, let's go ahead and say Shift Option Command E, and we'll call this blended result. At this point, I want to introduce something new, and that's the Skylum Luminar plugin. In Photographing the World 1 and 2, I used Nik Collection, which was then purchased by Google and discontinued. So when I created Photographing the World 3, I wanted to do everything manually, which is how I typically post-process my photos anyway. Photographing the World 4, I wanted to continue that. Now since then, Nik software has been acquired by DxO, and it has been revamped and re-released, so the plugins will live on. But when that happened, I actually switched from Nik Collection, so I started using different plugins. I started using Skylum Luminar. So today, in this lesson, what I want to show you is my favorite tools and plugins inside of that software suite. So in order to do it, I'm going to duplicate the layer first, and I'm just going to call this Luminar 1, and we're going to do this in stages. Now this is a brand new MacBook Pro, so I just loaded this plugin straight and from scratch because I wanted to make sure it's the absolute latest version. I also didn't put my license key in, so I can actually load this. And the reason I didn't put the license in is I wanted to show you that you can actually get 14 days free with this software. It's not very expensive software, so if you like it, definitely purchase it. It's going to speed up a lot of the things that we have been doing manually. So you can activate it, obviously, if you have a code, buy, but we can continue the trial and we can get right into the software. First of all, I like a clear workspace. It may look like this in the beginning, which gives you a bunch of different filters that you can apply, but I like to disable that and just add the sliders. And then here, where it says filters, we can add filters. Just like most plugin suites, I can actually go ahead and star them, and that will make them my favorite so I can find them really quick. And the cool thing about Skylum software, and Luminar particularly, is that it shows you everything that it does, and it actually allows you to read a little bit about what everything does. So if you're not sure what any of these do, it has a really nice example for you right there. But I'm going to start just with some basics. So we've been using Adobe Camera Raw filter, so let's start with Develop. Develop takes the place of the Camera Raw filter and gives you similar controls that you would have when you're editing RAW or Adobe Camera Raw filter. So here we can adjust things globally. In this case, we can pull the shadows up a little bit, we can change the warmth, we can change the white point here, bringing that up just a little bit, the blacks, everything that we can do that we would normally do in Adobe Camera Raw. Outside of that, however, Camera Raw is kind of limited for enhancing things. So we've had to use luminosity masking and different things like that to get more dynamic tones and contrast. But here we have things like Accent AI filter. Now this is kind of a magic filter. It's called Smart Enhancement. And you can see if I add that, it's going to add that right to the bottom of the stack. And if I change this, you're going to see it's just going to bump the contrast. But it's also going to protect the shadows and the highlights. So if I turn this up too much, now we're starting to look like an HDR image. We don't want to do that, but we can start to tweak this just a little bit. I've decided to add my favorites here so you can see them as we roll down. I'm going to go to the polarizer. Polarizer is pretty cool. Pay attention to the sky. If I change the amount here, it's going to add more blue and contrast in the sky, but as a side effect, down here in the water, it's flattening that out. So let's say we want to have the sky take on this effect, but not the water in the foreground. Well, here we can quickly just create a gradient mask, and we can click to draw that gradient mask, so it's just going to be in the sky. So you have these built right in to the filters, so you can paint, mask, ellipse, or gradient mask your desired effect. So that's the polarizer. Next one, dehaze, works exactly the same way that dehaze works inside of Lightroom. So it's going to find those areas of low contrast and add contrast. That one should be pretty self-explanatory. Brilliance and warmth is pretty nice. We also have image radiance we're going to talk about. But then we also have, one of my favorites, is advanced contrast. And advanced contrast takes things a little bit further by allowing you to have highlight contrast. So you see the sky right there. Midtones contrast, which is going to be most of the foreground. You can see that's going to add some deep tone contrast, and the shadows. So it's going to give us the options to manipulate individual elements. So in this case, I can add a little bit of contrast to the midtones, a little bit of contrast to the highlights, and then I can go up and balance all this out. So we have the dehaze, we have the polarizing filter, the accent AI filter, which is going to bring all of these details up, and then we have all of the balancing right here. If we needed to change the tint, whites, black point, all of that kind of stuff, let's just go ahead and roll this back just a little bit. Let's pull the blacks up just a hair. Not that much, like 5%. And here we can actually go through and start to basically balance all this, and when we feel they're good, we can actually pack them up. Now really, the AI filter is sort of like the magic filter here, where it's going to bring out those midtones and leave the shadows and highlights. So let's just find a good point to leave it right around 25. Also add one more, saturation and vibrance. So here I can actually change the vibrance a little bit too much, or the saturation. So this one's not really helping me that much, so I'm just going to right click it and delete it. And I think we have a good base to work with. Let's go ahead and apply this and take a look. Once that finishes, we can see the before and the after. It actually looks pretty good. Let's go back into Luminar and take it to the next step. I want to show you guys something that's fairly new to the software. Let's make this Luminar 2. Go back to Filter, Skyloom, Luminar 2018. At this point, tones are balanced. We have some saturation issues that we can handle too. Now it's time to get a little creative and a little bit artistic. Let's add one more filter. This is actually really cool and perfect for this situation if you want to create something stylistic, and that's down here under Creative. It's called Sun Rays. By default, we can actually place the sun center, and we can move this around, and you actually get light rays. So it's basically going to take a luminosity mask of this, highlights, and it's going to apply this inside of the highlights. So you can see anywhere where I have excessive highlights, obviously in shadows, nothing's going to happen. So we have to find a good place for this where it looks nice, you know, where we want it to sort of, well, I don't know if it's ever going to look realistic, but stylistic. So in this case, are we shooting at the sun and it's shooting light rays out from the center of the image, or are we doing this from over here where it's shooting light rays into the image? So we can kind of choose exactly where we want to place this. And in this case, I kind of like it, to be honest, up here. So let's go ahead and get that in the right position. Once this is set, and we can make little adjustments, you can see that these rays will change, but we can already start to change it by saying how much, which is the amount, so we can change the intensity, the look, the number, and the length, so we can actually pull the length down a little bit. The number is actually going to intensify the amount of tendrils here. I don't want too many. I actually kind of liked it the way it was, just like that. We can change the warmth. This is a little bit different. This assumes that you want to have a sun, so you can actually change this radius here. So you can see we just want to kind of make it soft, and you can say there's a glow radius as well, and the warmth. And then all of these things too, like randomize, it's just going to look a little bit crazy. But for the most part, what we want to do is just find something pretty soft and subtle, something a little bit like that. And we can change the look, slide that up a little bit. The sun rays, the amount looks good. The length, take that down, and we'll just tone it down just a little bit. So I think that's a good position for the sun to be, just like that. And let's go ahead and apply this, and then we're going to do one more thing. Now that that's finished processing, let's go and change this to Luminar 3 and cover a couple other stylistic choices. Once again, add filters. This time we're going to scroll down and let's use image radiance. Now I kind of like this too, because if I add, you can see that it's actually going to sort of compress some of the highlights. So you can see that if I turn it all the way down, it's actually going to give it this sort of soft, glowy look. Now obviously that's too much, but I'm going to leave it turned up all the way just for a minute. You can see I can mess with the brightness. This is too much, way too stylistic, but we're just going to use a tiny little bit of this. A tiny little bit of glow, just like that. I'll pull the shadows up as well. Amount, some brightness. I'm also going to add an Orton effect. And I'm going to turn this off for a second so we can see how this works. Standard Orton effect is basically going to sort of add the same sort of glow, but it's going to look a little bit different. Now here there's a type 1 and a type 2. Type 2 washes everything out. Type 2 sort of brings everything in, and we can kind of add the brightness. So the difference between the radiance and the Orton is definitely adding the glow. So once we get this up the way we want it, taking the contrast and the brightness, we can take the amount way down, but just a soft amount here. Let's go ahead and turn this back on. So we have the image radiance plus the Orton effect here, and now we can actually change some of this as well. So we can just make it a little bit more dramatic and soft. So this is going to be more like a glowy sort of effect here. And let's go ahead and apply this. All right, so if we before and after, well, I went a little overboard, but I did that on purpose. And the reason is what I want to do is just take the opacity down. And I kind of want this effect to be really subtle and only around the light rays themselves. So about 50 to 60% with a mask and with a gradient. Let's pick a radial mask from here to here. So it's only going to be in that side of the image where we're getting that. If I take a look at this really quick, you can see that it's just that portion. So now what I can do, brush in a little bit of the glow, a little bit around the light rays themselves, and we'll kind of cut it out in these other areas just to soften that transition. So it's pretty interesting. Now, go ahead and soften this out here, soften this area out here. Again, this is 100% style choice. And we go from here to here. So we intensify that glow a little bit. Now, at this point, this image is pretty fun. Again, not a big portfolio piece, though it is a 3-panel panoramic image, so you could print this really large. If you were going to print it, roll back that Orton effect just a little bit. You don't want that to be too intense because it does soften the detail. But here, what we can do is start to address some of the color. So I love these fall colors. The river looks nice. These leaves, everything. The green in the middle is kind of bothering me. Let's go to hue and saturation real quick. Anytime you have a problem with the greens, so in this case, I can go ahead and grab most of the greens here. I can turn the saturation down just to make sure I have everything. And it looks like we're coming into the cyan a little bit here. What I'm actually going to do is darken the trees a little bit. So we're going to darken them so they're not quite as intense, and I can actually change and tweak the saturation. You can also do this if you want. You can actually start to sort of roll them into a different tone. So to the right is going to be a little, well, let's just say electric, but to the left is going to add a little bit more yellow to them and make them feel a little bit more subdued, like they're starting to turn into fall colors. We can also take the lightness down just a little bit. So before and after, take some of that, well, the neon away from the trees and take some of the intensity away. So with a mask, let's go ahead and use a reflected gradient, something like this from here to here. Although I did it opposite, so let's undo that. Swap to white, just like that. And now I can just change the opacity here until I'm happy with the effect, making it a little bit more subtle. And at this point, we can change this opacity here. We want to bring that up, make it a little bit more intense lighting, let's say about 80%. Last thing here, we're going to do is just go to original ratio and clear this, and let's just crop this a little bit to get rid of those edges that were caused when we did the stitching. Now, I'm not really happy with this as a portfolio piece, but it is pretty interesting. Let's go ahead and apply that crop. One last thing here that's going to drive me crazy. There's a little white spot up there, so let's just go ahead and crop this a little bit more around that tree. And I'll get rid of this little clear spot. All right, so interesting image, nice little break from having to do everything manually. Let's take a look at everything we did. We took this image, and this image to blend it into one final. We then used Luminar by Skyloom Software to add contrast. Then we had some fun with some custom lighting as if we were shooting into the sun. Actually looks semi-realistic. Then we added a little bit of a radiance to it and an Orton effect just to sort of give it a little bit more of a lighting effect. And then we corrected that hue saturation in those trees just to make them a little bit less intense. So we basically went from the combined result here to here in just a few quick minutes. In Photographing the World 4, my main goal is to do mostly everything in a 100% manual method using manual blending techniques. But that doesn't mean that plugins aren't powerful. And I use Skyloom Luminar quite often, especially for effects like this or overall tonal contrast in the image. So if you like to use Nik Collection, if you like to use Luminar, go ahead and use them. But it's always important to remember how to do everything manually as well. That wraps up this lesson. Let's get back out there and explore some more of this beautiful landscape.